Hello everyone, today we talk about one of those topics that people interested in social history normally care about. But jokes aside, every once in a while, at this point I resumed the cycle/lottery, which, I don't know, it actually brings sometimes less interesting topics. As you know, I'm not definitely a socioeconomically oriented, historian by any stretch of the imagination. If you study history, you at least are versed by some degree in social history to a degree. If you go to university at this point, history is more akin to sociology to a degree than, unfortunately, a more complete picture about politics, for example, warfare, right? As Clausewitzians, we know that economy is mostly just something subordinated to this wonderful tree, and just to paraphrase the same from Clausewitz. But it is necessary. I must say, I don't keep not feeling really this enormous interest for social history. But whenever we cover these topics, I think that we made fairly decent videos, at least in very introductory fashion, because definitely my content is balanced in a way that does not privilege social history in any sense. But I'm possibly at this point the person who talked more about medieval society than any other channel, right? And when I talk about society, I don't talk about, oh, look at what they did to these people at the time. Look at the worst punishment, who were the most evil popes, and all this kind of stuff. It's more about trying to look at certain systemic dynamics that definitely apply, that are, in the sense, tasteful to appreciate when you realize that, of course, in pre-industrial societies, everything was much more homogeneous than we normally credited for. Like the big, also socioeconomical differences in the Middle Ages were smaller, of course, in comparison to the ones that exist, among probably the civilized world today. And this is true also we've seen it for warfare, for that matter. It's easier at that point to look at differences, to realize exactly what kind of moves from this basic line that otherwise today would be much more complicated to measure, right? Because it's not a monofactorial system. If there is a little spike in some phenomenon, say infantry victories at the beginning of the 14th century, you can read the thing more easily than if you were studying, I don't know, the 20th century. Naturally, like infantry at that point is a completely different thing. But I mean, in comparable sort of military changes, because at that point you have industrial societies, you have some broader global issues that are already actually in the Middle Ages and since ever had a deep impact on this pre-industrial societies, but in fact in the later centuries become much more intense to a degree, less predictable, etc. Now, and less studiable, meaning that if you, of course, like contemporary historians, I don't know, I have a beef with modernists because I believe that their entire didactic scanning of history is fantasy, that the modern age never existed. Contemporary historians, meaning the contemporary era, just the last couple of centuries, they're just, cute, like they exist, right? And they enter this realm without quite understanding too much, and it's fine. They're not dangerous. They're really naive in their approach to actual events. Medievalists are, of course, the best historians, as you may have already sort of sensed to a degree. But again, other jokes aside, when we talk about medieval society, we must be able to get the fundamentals right in order at that point to appreciate better our more habitual political military topics. And I treated this quite seriously. Medieval society is one of the oldest playlists that I've ever created. Over 200 videos. Admittedly, I trying to do lots of different stuff, right? But over 200 videos on 2700 is definitely a good basis. And that's medieval society alone. It's not just social history per se. And without that, you couldn't properly appreciate the broader picture. What I noticed, at least in the earlier days, when there were these pseudo historians, pseudo intellectuals, so to say, that approached YouTube paradoxically with some more intense care than today. Today it's the complete collapse. Nobody even pretends anymore. I noticed that for obvious reasons, mostly the influence of structuralism, social history was very much appreciated because there were certain topics that for this sort of almost deterministic aftertaste that they seem to have, because they're depersonalized. They talk about the bigger systems. They eliminate the evenemential. They eliminate the individual, whatever. Seemed more interesting for the liberal-leaning university thinking. When I started studying medieval history myself at university, I definitely had a much more structuralistic influence, even though I've never really embraced that. I was already interested in warfare in religious history, but even in these fields, I tended to have a more schematic and somehow simplistic and tendentially never fully deterministic or structuralistic view, but something especially a young mind is captured by, because the younger you are, the dumber you are, actually, the more socialistic interpretations of history seem sort of expandable, all right? Now, today we talk about famines. That, as you know, through the Malthusian cycles, through the entire sort of idea that we have a bit of social history throughout the centuries as a sort of, again, enormous mover that, however, has not much of a face, and it mostly speaks in historiography about quantities, numbers, some figures almost extracted out of, like, as if nothing around was happening. We've seen how mutable politics and warfare is. How can you even make these calculations by the degree that this historiography did without considering, for example, warfare in a given year, in a given context? They did. Of course, I'm not denying that there isn't any research on the topic, but in general, at least from even I remember the texts that they suggested us for preparing for the PhD selections, etc., pretty robust manuals written by experts in the field. I was struck by the complete lack, for example, military historical interest, or whenever it existed, it was more like a technological in nature. Coming from continental Europe, properly, there was normally nothing about warfare. When I read Anglo-American manuals, it was mostly a matter of technology, or again, this even more pushed sort of economic, quantitative dimension thrown into the fray. And aside from other differences and deep misunderstanding that does exist in different parts of the world and between sort of each other, also in that phase of the Middle Ages, say which countries were more important, less important, which were coming first and rose last at Similia, it looked as if the same Middle Ages were often presented in a pretty undynamic and even depressing way, because if you eliminate, for example, political, military, evenemential, but also, for example, institutional history, it's a bit difficult to explain a person why the Middle Ages were actually so cool and how much was civilizationally achieved in them. All right. Now, another topic that, as you know, I've always been deeply struck by, and the more I studied medieval history, the more I've grown convinced of having really been an incredibly impacting dynamic that is not given enough space and proper explanation to, is the so-called late medieval crisis, the great crisis of the mid-14th century. All right. The fact that, say, different eras would be scanned at some point by the spread of major pandemics, affecting, especially at this point in history, with the medicine, but mostly like the scarce sanitary, even just like properly biological fragility of the time, especially of the lower estates, would impact like largely probably the massive demographic figures and foundations and redraw the entire picture. And for the Middle Ages, we tend not to have much this approach. I mean, we all talk, for example, about the end of antiquity, and we point out that, for example, Justinian's pandemic would have basically and finally crippled what was left of late antiquity, that at some point, as a system, properly changed. It's a very superficial narrative that mostly resents of the fact that we think at some point, we need to think at some point, something collapsed at that point in a complete sense. From this moment onwards, something else begins. What was before is not there anymore. This is evidently wrong. When we come to the Middle Ages, and we especially look at the Renaissance, the general narrative is a positive one, right? Especially in the Anglo-Saxon world and Protestant countries, there is an idea of general progress, starting with the early modern age, one mostly funded there also through the idea of the spread of scientific ideas that the terrible Catholic Church would have not allowed to spread. So there is all a teleology and a determinism about such dynamics. There are also very oblivious, in fact, of the massive continuity, of course, of Catholic Europe in the primacy sort of in European civilization for quite a while, right? And even and especially at that point, I mean, I don't even have to cite like at which point we are in historiography in the research about the validity of the Inquisition, also as an educational system for that matter, how sort of dramatic the situation instead just in terms of lay justice was in most of the Protestant world in comparison. We would have to actually look at that. I hope the topic is gonna come up soon in the cyclical extraction here. Nevertheless, the blow that, and that's of course a simplistic narrative, but it's a simplistic narrative because it's fundamentally moralistic and politicized to a degree, because everybody knows, and this is, again, what we normally learn in universities, I don't know in the Anglosphere where that's the case or not, that the later Middle Ages and the early modern age witness to a radical, magnitudinal, categorical, macroscopical collapse of individual liberty all across European society, right? This is not a matter of contention. It's like this point, end of the story. The problem is that we attribute in this sense also to the idea of loss of liberty per se, just an absolutely negative character, which is incorrect, given the fact that the Ancien regime is the one that brought this system that had collapsed, as we will see now in the late Middle Ages, from a demographic point of view, that, in a sense, exactly because the crisis had struck, required more authoritarian governments and, in this sense, a greater dedication of people to this more autocratic rules, that in any case are the same ones that create the modern state, that expand power, that lead Europeans across the world, that cement some more robust, stable, permanent institutions, etc. And so basically, literally everything that we celebrate about the contemporary state, and or at least how, say, states developed this point in history. The same goes for literacy, for example. You don't have to think that literacy spread simply because, I don't know, people were freer. That's not how it actually worked, so social-culturally speaking. We should be way more careful about the statement and assessment. And again, by talking more about modern history, civilian history, because we mostly talk about warfare, and that's why I said that I grafted a new branch of modern manualistic modern history to explain these things better. Things essentially cannot compare even with probably the pre-crisis medieval civilization in terms of individual liberty. And this does not mean that people necessarily lived better. All right, some people live better, some people live worse, but in general, like when you look at the modern age, yes, there is less liberty in institutions, people have less power, but they also live better. They actually become richer, and this all thanks to the ancien regime that at some point sort of collapsed on itself, but had literally maintained the helm throughout all the mechanism. And it's actually the more quote-unquote absolutistic countries that are the ones that witnessed to this liberalization earlier, not because of oppression, but because actually the state had made an enormous job at providing with the means for everyone to sort of have more individual liberty that was used not to maintain a more cohesive system, but for spreading essentially nationalistic and or socialistic fourth estate ideologism at the control, by the way, of essentially third estaters. For not talking about the collapse of religious views and so on. It's still, this is especially true, it's a bit true everywhere, but especially still many, I realize, Anglo-American conservatives look at the Enlightenment, not all of them, but still, like in unequivocally positive ways, which wouldn't be a problem in and of itself, because people think that I'm a reactionary person who doesn't like the Enlightenment, or at least, would like things to have not changed. But what strikes me of that is that, first of all, they don't realize that before this time, for example, in terms of 18th century philosophy, everything had already been said in the 17th. And in terms of the foundation also for individual liberty, concepts of freedom, religious freedom, this is all contained within the same religion that certain people claim to have instead sort of prevented this. There is, especially the boogeyman of the Catholic Church is still the thing that the average fourth estater in the West today believes in for essentially personal problems, because again, historiography is eloquently all over the West when studying the things actually correct in stressing the fact that there was hardly anything defective in that system per se. But there is also an historiography that wrote mostly on the basis of ideologism up to very few centuries ago, because the countries that needed to attack the Catholic world in order to justify their own modern development didn't have essentially any better narrative, because basically the entire history, the history of politics of the church and more is essentially against them. But also considering that their countries had a prestigious Catholic tradition that decided to erase with terrifying iconoclasm, heresy, and sort of other vicious things, including, in fact, incredibly much more repressive means than the ones that the Catholic Church had for that matter. In any case, when we look at the general picture here, that I like to digress because this is a very broad topic today. It's one of those videos that will end up, Schwerpunkt talks for 2 hours without getting to the point, etc. But it's not much that I don't make videos like those anymore, but it's important because how do you introduce a topic like famines, right? That's my problem also with society. I could give you lots of numbers, whatever, but let's be honest, who the hell cares about this? It's not even certain. Like people who presume to be able to calculate, I don't know, major demographic changes in, even in the late Middle Ages, we've seen it, like in the video, criticism to the bias in favor of the Byzantine Empire, have some problems with, I think, the actual evidence and actual historical method for that matter. So a moral history, I think, is more important to also objectively and accurately assess these changes, all right? But again, what troubled me, again, is the idea, the notion that there would be some sort of complete darkness or lack of development, and that what happened in the 18th and the 19th century wasn't just a direct continuation and advancement and development of the extraordinary scientific, philosophical development of the previous centuries, rooted in the Middle Ages and the classical world, which is still instead a myth, like the one of the Dark Ages, the one of reactionarism, of obscurantism, whatever, that continues living essentially in the imagination of people, rather than in any actual historical literacy. Now, these changes that Europe faced during the 14th and 15th centuries are thus not much important because we see, oh, look, the demographics went down. Yes, but what does that actually mean, or at least what does that cause? Which I think is much more interesting in any broader political or military sense, right? If you think of the Middle Ages as a dark pool of anarchy where, plague was just one of the random things that could happen to you, and that when you're talking about the Black Death is just some sort of standard or timeless kind of type of epidemic that could break out in the Middle Ages, it means that you simply have never studied history of politics or institutions. Like you haven't a palest idea of what, for example, this brought about in the military field, and why, from a social standpoint. Also observing, as we were saying before, that not only the medieval civilization objectively did shrink as a consequence of this change, and this maybe everybody realizes that paradoxically, and this is why, but it's also a matter of perspective, we haven't really created the idea of a death of medieval civilization, is that political institutions in this last centuries of the Middle Ages actually drastically consolidated their relative power. And that's where the ancien regime is actually affirmed. Right, and there you have humanism and the Renaissance, and so you have to be able, you must reconcile the two things, right? How could it be that in a moment of still demographic depression, where still this, as we'll see now, that the plague represented itself cyclically, and generally speaking, like also the 16th century was a terrifying moment in terms of wars and further, in economic disasters, etc. How can we reconcile the idea of progress with something like that, right? Not because this progress, as we explained, did not happen, right? But because in order to explain that progress, including the continuity with the Middle Ages, which absolutely did occur, there isn't a real death. There is mostly like a re-edition of medieval civilization. One could make a simple sort of parallel comparison with the late antiquity as well, but we're not making that while being a much less sort of dynamic and growing civilization like the one at the peak of, in fact, the Middle Ages, the 13th to 14th century, just before plague, by the way, would be, in fact, allegedly considered as some superior happy moment compared to the former as well, right? That's the paradox that still, I think, as people in general in the world, we should explain, and we still haven't done in any profitable historiographical term. Just think from the military standpoint, there's the quote-unquote military revolution. It sounds more like putting patches compared to what was happening before and how big armies were in the heart of the Middle Ages compared to the relatively sorrowful things that you still find during the Renaissance. And most people do not realize this. They think that, again, there is quote-unquote progress. Why? Because they heard, it's because firearms, or look here, infantry is more important. But they don't even know that infantry was constituted by people that were much less free than before, and were actually hired, armed, and trained by the great princes of Europe that were the only ones that could even afford that military development, and therefore didn't even really fear from these soldiers like in previous centuries would have done of some kind of uprising, because communities were really more autonomous and dangerous before. So these last 2 centuries are pretty troubled in reality, and largely witness to some changes driven by the interplay of famine, disease, and limited. As far as medical progress, by the way, it's not like things would drastically change until, in fact, and quite gradually, the later modern age, and to much extent also just a century ago. The bubonic plague pandemic that ravaged the entire continent between 1347 and 1351, commonly remembered as the Black Death, produced truly catastrophic consequences. Scholarly analysis of skeletal evidence from cemeteries like East Smithfield in London, these were essentially some plague pits, right, indicate that the epidemic selectively killed individuals who exhibited markers of prior physiological stress, or at least there was an important incidence of that, such as animal hypoplasia or periosteal lesions, meaning those already in poor health facing elevated risks of death during the outbreak. This is a very important dynamic that is often not really underplayed. It is well understood that the lower strata of society at the time, as they had always been historically, and again, things change only for a few hundred years ago, were normally weaker from a biological point of view. They were worse nourished. They lived in more precarious hygienic conditions, very often in crowded spaces, and or depending on very scarce resources, depending on sort of city, countryside. I don't think that the countryside had it actually that better during the Black Death epidemic, because intuitively one may think that if people start dying in droves in the cities, all of a sudden the agricultural, say the rural communities will somehow gain more political and social relevance in comparison. This is actually wrong, right? First of all, there was much less demand for a while, and so there was actually a very few that these peasants could get in exchange for food to begin with. There was more in particular a great political and social instability. The elites reinforced their role dramatically. I made multiple videos in the medieval society playlist explaining how that actually happened. So these people had it worse. In any case, plague spread anyway. There were, curiously enough, some areas of Europe, like, I don't know, Milan, that was also quite central, for example, or Poland, that apparently has mysteriously escaped this plague. So it's very interesting to see the spreading patterns do not seem so overwhelmingly consistent. I mean, if you consider that Milan was, together with Paris, the largest city in Europe at that point, well, how could they even survive? I mean, they couldn't simply isolate themselves. The city did require some major logistical connections with the rest of the world, with the sea, etc., from where the plague had actually come through the Italian ships connected with the Orient, with the steppes. You know, the ideally it's the Mongols, the Tatars, actually, that with their infected carcasses bombarded Genoese Caffa during the local siege, and the Genoese ships brought back the terrible plague in the ports of Sicily, as they rose up the peninsula up to Genoa and so on. This is definitely the pattern that we can easily track from the sources. Just the other day I was browsing, those very same years. It's very easy to actually reconstruct the various waves of plague throughout these years, right? So in basically a few years, almost all of Europe really was invested by this. Nobody virtually escaped. And again, we don't have even very clear means of appreciation of this. We know, of course, that paradoxically more advanced countries were struck. There is, in this late medieval crisis, in fact, a sort of resurgence of those countries that had historically been less densely populated and that had remained a bit more at the fringe. For example, Central Europe gain importance during this point. Poland, as we've seen also in different videos about the 14th century, found itself with essentially, in relative terms, a demographic surplus, which meant also wasn't particularly specialized labor, but they had a lot of agricultural goods, of timber. They began to export this, and given the consolidation of elite power, a paradox is that the volume of trade did not actually decrease, that especially the elites were moving all of this, and that it starts actually traveling even more to even more distant places, exactly because in relative terms there were more investments to make it happen, and also countries had grown more dependent on imports because of the economic crisis, and so the various logistical hubs and connections were reinforced during this period. And in fact, we are actually in a period of great mercantile but actually banking consolidation, right? If the great medieval civilization had been about a big deal about trade expansion and early forms of banking had yet to consolidate, late Middle Ages witnessed to the radical reinforcement of banking power. At this point, it was almost all in the hands of the Italians. We made multiple videos about this, but all European powers were connected with it. And essentially, what happened at the outskirts of Europe wasn't any better. The Levant, for example, lost importance compared to Europe. So we have this gloomy idea of what was happening in those centuries in the old world. But if you look at it in perspective, North Africa, Eastern Europe, the Levant, all sort of the broader Byzantine area that is taken over by the Turks kind of collapses, is further destructured. It's at some point sort of, because of the crisis itself, look at the Ottoman Empire, capable of agglutinating some greater autocratic power that can cash basically much wider areas that are historically exhausted by plague and war. Think about Serbia, think about powers that, again, had been really springing out very, very quickly, very frequently from here and there in the previous centuries, and at this point are more or less leveled up to basically almost the contemporary era, right? So it's even in those worlds, truly, medieval society in its institutional fundamentals continues until the contemporary era, right? And by far the most dynamic part of Western Eurasia and the Mediterranean is exactly Western Europe. Even with the, as we were saying before, relative and later rises of parts like Central Europe and Northern Europe in comparison to Western Europe, Southern Europe, as they had been in the previous centuries, still Western Europe remains by far the most solid, advanced, and enterprising, also colonizing, for that matter, part of the world. And this happens also for the different reasons of mental frame, right? Colonial ventures were surely the fruit of this increasing of a crisis, essentially. We need resources. We have to find new routes. We have to find new avenues, new markets, and curiosity and application arises, unlike in previous centuries where everything was more simply at hand, right? Banking, for example, had been born during the High Middle Ages, but it's not until the mid-14th century that banks start practicing in Europe some forms of sort of self-salvaging, guaranteeing mechanisms that will ensure, also with the distribution of wealth into different branches and the diversification of investments, etc., paradoxically, some much more stable market, even when the economy was not so thriving as it had been before, especially in absolute terms from a productive standpoint. But the elites cash that, as we've seen, for themselves, and they're able to maintain a vitality, to define better their own policies. Territorially speaking, I made lots of videos about the decline of universalism and the affirmation of ever more robust nuclei of essentially national powers that are actually a defeat, right? Are a collapse compared to the truly ecumenic scale of the medieval imperial civilization and the papacy, the empire. But we will also come to look at this a bit more in depth. Like, it feels strange to say, but after 2,700 videos on Schwerpunkt, most of which are about medieval history, we haven't really fully actually addressed this topic. Or if we have done it, at least we still need to sort of properly introduce it and analyze it. There are some few videos that address it in some more or less explicit terms. Now, contemporary witnesses were gripped by profound terror in the face of the plague outbreak. Population losses varied considerably from one place to another, differing sharply between regions, individual cities, and even neighboring villages. In some severely affected areas, such as parts of England, France, Italy, and Spain, that were the most advanced parts of Europe, mortality allegedly reached like one third. Some people say even more, depending. Well, of course, there are some communities that may have been struck up to 50-60% or even more loss ratios. But and what strikes here is how fast that happened. Like within 1 or 2 years, naturally other locations experienced lower rates. when you look at the picture, it's very difficult to quantitatively observe this. What you see, if anything, is a massive collapse that is both moral and material. There's no doubt about this. We don't understand whether this was more a consequence of actual people dying, and so physically disappearing, or, which is more likely, also a greater moral impact, right? We will talk a bit more, especially through history of art, of the notorious intensification of death representation, terror, sort of darker. There are some art forms, some iconography that is more reminiscent of the Romanesque period, even within Gothic art, than at least what the Gothic art had been in the 13th century, that it was pure light and sense of transcendence, of immortality. So this thing strikes deeply from a moral point of view, and you can't really see it represented. There is even a collapse of art quality. If you really look at, for example, illumination, just for saying once, you realize that they were much simpler and much more sort of secularly minded in the later Middle Ages, in part because more books survived, and of course some were cheaper and they weren't just beautiful illuminations of the earlier days. Even in late antiquity they had excellent representation there, so they were not much the product of an elite culture anymore, because the literacy was spreading. But paradoxically, as we said before, also elite power was, and so you do have a great difference also codicologically, paleographically. We're not entering that, but there is definitely a sense of more modern and secular belief and behavior taking place. We've seen this well in the videos about humanism, trying to understand what essentially the Renaissance men had found out, because in this major crisis of values, of meaning, it's obvious that certain traditional ideas reemerge, however, observed from a lower standpoint, a more difficult one, that looks at them more like almost an impossible achievement to attain, and not like, I don't know, the previous elites, even of the establishment, the centuries past, would have simply left them on horseback and during the Crusades, sword in hand, right? It's not like elites were not warlike, but you see this worsening, you see this darkening in the general sentiment towards life, towards existence, towards the afterlife. If you think about it, the Protestant Reformation and all those movements that constitute a prodrome to that basically speaks of it. It's basically the nullification of works, the fact that you can't become divine by the same divine gracial transcendence and reward from your deeds. And so that's the scale of the actual mental and biological collapse of people during this time. It's incredibly interesting to look at it from also a military standpoint. We made a video which we're quoting Montaigne, explicitly stating that essentially, like, if in this world again of the Renaissance, a world upside down because infantry had retaken sort of its space on the battlefields, but as we've seen, still through an subordination. The question is, as elites, because that's what Montaigne was speaking for, like, how do we, he said, like, manage this? Who does hold the command here? Who is at the helm if our elite element collapses? And think about that, because given the French wars of religion, etc., there were active threats really carried out against the establishment, with sort of mini revolutions. If you think about the Front, they were the same, again, war of religions, but the Saint-Jacquerie had constituted this back in the day, in the aftermath of the plague, with the defeat of Poitiers, the capture of the king. The peasants said, but you can't, as an elite, protect us anymore. We're going to rise, and they were brutally exterminated for that matter. And this happened over and over again. This happened also in Germany, as we've seen in the videos about the German peasant revolt, that they're a bit later, because again, these countries arrive a bit later, and they also fall a bit later, once again, dip down. We were seeing yesterday in the video about the Landsknechte that there isn't, again, this progressive increase in power, for example, in Central Europe more than much in those first centuries of the modern age. So it's a complicated picture, but still a coherent one when you're able to appreciate it on a broader scale, which is exactly, I think, in a strictly social sense, what matters in this, as we were saying at the beginning, relatively homogeneous systems, right? Systems at least that did not differ so much from one another at the root. I'm sure I wanted to say lots of other things, but as I had started to take this tangent, but we will, if anything, yes, there's a point I wanted to make actually very specifically, that as I was reading yesterday, but this I know because I had been reading it for a long time, those chronicles about probably the 40s of the 14th century, they all have their little chapter, more actually big chapter, about the Black Death. But at the same time, the way it is discussed, it's like, okay, this was this great mortality. People started dying in these horrifying ways, etc. But at the same time, the chronicle could simply continue with what was happening politically, militarily. We know there were expeditions where this was going on. It's not like Europe stopped, or that in the moment this massive blow seemed just to say, oh my God, no, this is a general problem. Everybody, the world shall unite. Things kept going on as if nothing was, more or less. And the chroniclers do not really address this thing further. Right? Say, at this point, all these people died. Okay, but, then there was this war, and that this guy went to that city, and that the thing happened. And it continues just like that. There isn't a broader reflection on why this thing had happened. Or they probably didn't care, because to them it was, again, probably puzzling, but still connected, obviously, with a sense of we deserve it because of our sins, and we all know this very well since the common era and the condition of humanity, and all these miseries and all these sins and all these problems that were mostly documented. There was nothing strange, but they also don't really historiographically look at it and say, oh my God, this thing is going to change the history of the world, isn't it? They don't really think that. And it's really, or at least they may have thought that, but they didn't write it down. And this is also very interesting, because the history of the world did really change from that point onward quite deeply. But they just didn't have probably the mental frame to consider this in broader historiographical terms on the longer term. And of course, what was happening in the moment, also after those deaths, was actually very important. And as I was saying before, if you study that only from a societal point of view, and if you exclude what was happening from a military point of view, a political point of view, internationally, and all those matters, you're basically taking away the most important part of this. They understood themselves that this was something relatively low in terms of broader importance, what was happening in the world. Not a little thing, but a lesser thing, right? Now, as you can imagine, because precise records were scarce, these demographic impacts can only be approximated, and yet broad estimates indicated roughly 1/3 of Europe's inhabitants, around 30 million people, perished in barely under 5 years, marking one of history's most horrifying mortality crises. You don't find this trail either in the same chronicles. You don't find chronicles that say, oh, well, 5 years ago, there were so many more people, right? We've written down when these people died and, all what occurred in relation with that, but in general, life continued. The systems, yes, suffered of a shattering, but it wasn't as if this had been, first of all, just the only bad thing that was going on. Because as we know, and that's why we're talking about famines today, the Black Death was mostly prepared by other disasters that weakened further the population, so allowed for this plague to spread more easily to begin with. Surely there were lots of these epidemics spreading, mostly from Central Asia, mostly because of the promiscuity between sort of men and animals and all this stuff, and among nomads, horsemen, etc. But how many had they always existed? Why did at this time this thing simply came out of that. It would be easy to say, well, okay, it somehow happened. And so we don't have to care about that. Another thing is realizing that if you start weakening the biological fiber of people, this stuff is much easier to spread. Like if you have like 13th, 14th century society mostly spent the greatest part of entire civilization to also sort of successfully fight wars, to build more robust systems, etc. But you have also dramatically attrition yourself and loss of resources, etc. Well, this weakness will be felt, right? Lots of people will have been broken. There will have, just the other day I also made a video about, for example, the crisis of Florentine republicanism, and say the Florentine plague is very well documented as, okay, well, Florence was by far the best documented city in the world at the time, but in general, right, you can see there that there were lots of troubles in the previous generations that somehow were conducive to these disasters, that were not isolated. It's sort of very strange, and it would be very interesting to analyze this in contemporary to our world, right? You know, how much catastrophism and, in this sense, a negative mindset has taken over the most advanced civilization that the world has ever seen. While these things have also kind of always happened. When you start reading 14th century chronicles that are normally more advanced than one of the previous centuries, and people start really writing in ways that are very similar to our own in strictly modern terms, you realize that there is some great attention to disasters, and they somehow start concentrate in the 20s, the 40s, and they seem like of unprecedented frequency. Now, the question is, what did happen? Was there any sort of broader climatic change that made, I don't know, at some point, weather crazy and agriculture suffer? Speaking of famines, and at this point, was sort of weakening the population. Well, I personally think that you can easily mess up a system just politically speaking. So if you look at all the wars that were being fought, it doesn't seem to me that, you know, if it snowed once in summer, or it was hot in winter at some point in a chronicle somewhere, this is indicative of some greater, I don't know, everything was changing. It's worth noticing that those scholars, those historians were recording that. We should ask ourselves whether it was attributing sort of greater importance to disasters that somehow had always happened, as they always do in the history of mankind, or if there was an actually larger incidence. All right. What we know, however, is that from the Black Death onwards until essentially the early 18th century, this epidemic represented itself cyclically, right? That wouldn't abandon the world for a long time. In the aftermath of the disaster, additional waves of various epidemic illnesses that probably were also in fact a compound of different ones swept through different parts of the continent. If you're talking in 14th century, recurrences struck in intervals such as 1360 to 63, 69 to 71, 74 to 75, 90, 1400. Naturally, again, every place has a different history, but these waves sort of rebooted, recircled, with plague outbreaks continuing across Europe well into the 15th century and beyond. Right? In the moment, again, especially the 14th century was pretty tough. The second half of the century is considered unanimously considered essentially one of the worst times in the medieval millennium. I mean, one of the worst, right? Especially the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Somehow, then the system began to restabilize, in part also because, yes, there is this immediate shock, immediate destabilization. And people like even about this to draw a catastrophistic picture. But if you actually realize that in just a generation, much more robust political systems reemerge at this point with all those safety nets and guards to withstand this greater blows, you realize that the crisis had at least importantly strengthened these institutions that, as always, in times of crisis, let's say, there can be a major distraction, especially in case of major waves of conquest of destruction. Europe did not really see that because warfare was very destructive to an extent, but also pretty much habitual among these neighbors that were very often the same people. They spoke the same language, they fought at close range, and if anything, it was mostly struggling, vying for power, rather in a particular regime, rather than say raising to the ground simply the country was next to you. This in Europe does not actually happen. It would have they technically lacked the means themselves, because also armies, yes, there is the phase of the free companies, etc., that start roaming Europe in this few decades, really. But if you look at that, it's more like powers called them to take advantage of more shattered minor powers, and they always maintain control in the end, rather than simply sort of suffer some kind of invasions or destruction just per se, right? Catastrophism often goes in parallel with self-loathing, and so the idea that at some point, oh my God, there is pure anarchy, the Middle Ages was brutal, everything was right. It's basically also typical foretastator, phrenastanic behavior, attitude that does not want to see the most microscopic evidence of a system that actually withstood the crisis and became even stronger than before, right? Civilization did not fall. It shrank, importantly, dramatically, but its foundations actually consolidated, interestingly enough, and even developed further, right? But if we stick to the sort of sanitary picture, plague itself settled into an endemic pattern across Europe, never fully disappearing and therefore creating huge issues in general. Periodic recurrences of infectious outbreaks combined with recurring episodes of famine at irregular and unpredictable intervals became really the norm, and or were starting being documented in ways that especially modern, modern historiographer, also modern era studies tend to sort of study better because they're better documented. And the impression that we have is, in fact, like for everything more or less that addresses the last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages, in particular sort of before the mid-14th century, there is a tendency to make it, to put everything in one box from, say, the mid-14th century to, I don't know, the end of the 18th, right? It's as if that idea of society, of the Ancien regime, especially if we stop to places like France, etc., then the Ancien regime continues up to the early 20th century, really, in some countries. But that this sort of the cyclical crisis would have been typical of this era, and it's not like they didn't exist before, but they wouldn't exist with the same pattern. The truth is that we know really few, but was actually happening before. It's very difficult to be specific about it. As I was saying before, I know we don't think that there was a major pandemic at some point in the previous centuries of the Middle Ages. There's no real indicator of that. But we also tend to, again, pair certain disasters because of the sake of narrative when things start collectively go wrong, and so we may actually have lost 1 or 2 things that were happening before were equally sort of bad, but were happening in, so maybe not equally bad, but were happening, if anything, in fact, in a different context, but a context that was rising and expanding, and we don't see as particularly dramatic. This we can say for the so-called 16th century Renaissance, for the so-called 12th century Renaissance. All right, these were actually terrible moments, full of wars, of devastations, of economic crisis, but overall it seems as if the picture was expanded, which is largely correct, right? But it was also happening so gradually that sticking simply to the narrative perhaps is not even the best way to tell the story, all right? And unpredictability, brutality, destruction, epidemics, and so on existed also before, and there is really nothing to kid with it. And naturally here I'm not even touching on the issue of the broader intercontinental connection, the Pax Mongolica, that surely also facilitated the spread of illnesses together with communications, right? So there is all a reason for that. But especially when you study history, you realize that all it's entwined, that there is a broader tendency, a broader soul, a broader spirit of the era that sort of makes sense, and that seems to be leading and or causing, triggering the same changes as a consequence. This is exactly, by the way, what they believed, like the plague was a cause of the sin of men that evidently had been somehow worse. And so what you were getting at this point was you had deserved, considering all the brutality, the violence, the wars, the destruction of the previous centuries. People had become worse, right? Also through a greater amount of wealth, material, apparent, sort of evanescent in this sense, ephemeral economic stability. And so this is all very interesting to see in perspective, but it's really the proper narrative that you can provide by realizing that it's not even the plague that matters, it's what the system had predisposed itself to that essentially brought about this mechanisms. While these twin crises rarely engulfed the whole of Europe simultaneously or with uniform severity at least, because surely they often overlapped in a broader sense, their cumulative effect was relentless. And so it's this systemic picture that matters. They systematically prevented any substantial demographic recovery and instead caused the population to shrink even further over the following decades. This prolonged decline reversed only around the mid-15th century, and even then the turnaround occurred unevenly, appearing in some regions while others remained stagnant. Right? So this is also another aspect you want to appreciate. Plague kills, all right? But the system in and of itself is shattered, right? For example, if you pick the early 15th century, the Hussite wars alone destroyed Bohemia, all right? One third of Bohemian population is going to have disappeared. The system collapsed. It was a total disaster. The country was conquered, eventually controlled by the Habsburgs. It lost its sovereignty. And so how do you explain that? Is it the plague? Is it the general crisis, whatever? No, these are evidently political mechanisms. And much of what we see in terms of further difficulty of sort of recovering from this is the blow in itself. As we were saying before, it's also the moral dimension. Why did even Hussites emerge in that moment in history? I made a video about the Hussites, actually many videos about the Hussites, but I was thinking specifically about the one of the Age of Councils. Why all those religious issues in the late Middle Ages? Because the system had been shattered, right? In sort of historical insight, we can say for good, right? Universal authorities would never return the way they had rampantly emerged in the heart of the Middle Ages. And as a consequence, the same Catholic unity of the Societas Christiana collapsed. All right, it goes all in pair with the further territorialization of power, nationalization of power, the Ottoman invasions. Everything was understood as being a result of sin, and this is obvious when you had, I don't know whose side, king on the throne like George of Podebradi is trying to distract others by saying, never mind that there's a heretical monarch, what had been once the heart of 14th century Europe with the Luxembourgs and the Holy Roman Empire centered in Prague, etc. It's look at the Turks, make crusades against the Turks. And well, in such a situation, that was the paradox, like the fact that somebody like from that religious background could make these claims is just like, I don't want to draw contemporary parallelisms, but you always find that kind of nonsensical hypocrisy that is actually masquerading like a much broader political and moral disorientation, right, in critical moments. Moreover, even after growth finally resumed in those more fortunate areas, a very long period spanning many additional decades was required before the continent's overall population managed to climb back to the figures it had reached during the early years of the 14th century. It's not until the 17th century that, for example, the great European metropolises start re-expanding. Very often, not even reach some places, not until the 19th century, reached the same level of population and urban expansion that they had during the Middle Ages. Some massive, even the same sort of infrastructural works of city, rings, cathedrals, etc., notoriously were finished, especially cathedrals, because city rings had become, at least by sort of the medieval engineering standards, obsolete quite soon. But in general, especially at that point, that our cathedrals were largely, at least, finished, at least those who had not been completed in time before the plague, in particular, in the 19th century. Now, from the 1320s to the 1340s, repeated famines, most of which remained localized to areas of limited, rather than enormous extent, severely compromised the health resilience of the poorest and most malnourished layers of society. And this seems to be, in hindsight, also the greatest, at least predisposing factor, if we can't say the indirect cause, of such massive demographic collapse. Right? We have an entire playlist dedicated to the 14th century crisis, but you also have to study what was happening in the immediate before, and for that you can still partially see society, government. That there are playlists all dedicated to this for the Middle Ages. You can check again, just the video I made the other day about the crisis of Florentine republicanism. Right, that speaks volumes about the situation. Defeat after defeat, right? You bleed white in many ways, and especially this is starting to crash the lower strata of the population and start rising up, right? And this is in fact yet another period, the peasant revolt, the salaried workers revolt of the mid 14th century. Big chapter in sort of historical rebellism, so to say, and prefiguring, in fact, with certain ideologies. We were talking about the Hussites, for example. You can't see what Tyler John Bowles. You can look at some of it's political ideology with moral ideology. Even the Cathars back in the day, in a moment of growth, although, had basically stemmed from the same social instances, aside also from the religious standpoint. So it's actually always the same communism, the same populism that routinely reemerges to erode, like the tectonic serpent, the root of the world, right? And at every step manages a little bit more to do so, right? I will probably post in the top fixed comment down below enough videos to remind you of how much I made on the topic. I can spoiler you that I prepared a video about the Jacquerie from a strictly military standpoint, because everybody says the Jacquerie, this massive private. How did that happen, actually? Like, where and how? What forces are we talking about? How did the French nobility successfully repress that? Also in times of enormous turmoil, for that matter, with the English that were swarming across great swathes of Atlantic front. And so it's all a great issue compound. And this, again, by far was not a good moment. You realize that the resources are being exhausted. We've seen it especially well in the regional series, where at this point politics tend to shrink. There is also a very strange dynamic whereby certain ruling houses hardly went extinct until the 14th century. The 14th century, there's a recompaction through marriages, because different branches go extinct and different, even entire kingdoms. Think about in Central Europe, at some point you had a single guy that had the crowns of 4 different kingdoms, right? If you look at the Jagiellonians, if you look at the Luxembourgs, there is even the Habsburgs, like a continuous elite mechanism to grab as much as possible and to centralize as much as possible, at least in just one point, through the surplus of other places, while in fact these were being completely structured into failed states, into elective monarchies. All right, in the West, things went discreetly better, to say the least, but at the same time, there is a process of recompaction, sometimes of dynastic crisis, and this compounded all with the political issues, with wars, and more. Right, the Capetian clan, for example, I was just thinking about it, like didn't really have any major war against one another before the 14th century. Then you have Burgundy emerging, you have different rebellions against the king led by maybe the son or the brother, whatever. These things had not existed before. You had seen, in the Angevin system and in the English one, if you want, but because that was smaller and tendentially less compact, right? At certain points, also only, like, because those had lived better times before in the 15th century. Think about the Wars of the Roses, etc. As if the place was not enough for everybody, right? Especially when, in that case, the English lost, the place where they could routinely go plunder without affecting their own country across the channel. So the deep, broader picture of the 14th, 15th century that we have drawn, for example, from a military standpoint, we often talk about that, is all one with this. When you manage to interpol, to overlap all these factors and dynamics, you will realize how they are all uniquely coherent. You can say uniquely just for this specific era, for this specific centuries, but definitely declined in sort of medieval Europe and particular areas that had been guiding the same civilization. They are actually very, very telling and very characteristic of the era. I haven't created a playlist that it's just about the 14th and 15th century combined. But again, the great crisis of the mid-14th century, you can check also the 14th and 15th century playlist respectively, will show you that darkness, in a sense, that sort of almost that unprecedented realpolitik made of pretty bitter compromises in the backdrop of a very drastic and unprecedented shrinking of material collapse, etc., especially at the lower level, and probably a crystallizing of a regime that is what we call like the ancient one. Now, by intensifying the effects of chronic undernourishment among those groups who suffered shortages most acutely and regularly, these food crises created fertile ground that allowed epidemics to propagate far more easily. Compounding the problem, Europe's population had grown rapidly in preceding generations. So the plague could simply make a target shoot, and this increase, in fact, occurred without any corresponding development in medical knowledge or at least in everyday hygienic practices. This is not 100% true. I mean, there were infrastructures. I sometimes made a video about properly hygiene and Italian communes, all the various sewing system and so on. Those had importantly advanced. They had advanced also by the amount of medieval cities that were much more populated, densely populated than they had been in antiquity, for example, where population had been more evenly distributed. And so in the most densely populated zones, precisely those places where the highest numbers of badly housed, underfed individuals and entire struggling families were forced to live in close proximity, the prevailing sanitary conditions offered almost no protection at all against initial appearance and subsequent rapid spread of contagious disease. Right? There was a redistribution also of the populace, especially in the lower estates. Then actually richer people could isolate themselves, could shut themselves down in their palaces. They could have stored more food. And so in any case, there weren't many ways to escape that. In fact, the art of the time shows the pretty ubiquitous memento mori motive, where death dances really with everyone and beats really everybody. And there is this deep sense of the caducity of life and the certainty of sort of death, of this terrible, unpredictable, evil, sadistic fate that comes to crush, in fact, the hopes of victory and transcendence and transfiguration that had really, animated the souls of people that, as we've seen very often in our biographical content, did not really have kind of very good or sort of happy lives in terms of mortality, of of terrible deprivations, whatever, but seem to have a much greater spirit, seem to have a much greater positivity towards the world and the possible achievements. What we realize is that for this crisis, that whole thing kind of dies, and it does so in this sense without much of a counter coup. There is in the Renaissance surely a renewed centrality, as we were saying before, of man intended mostly in philosophical elite sense. But even in that, as we explained, we're looking at a model, at a theory. It's something that was being recovered also through the better philology, the research of the classics, and so the reactivation of a traditional wisdom that on Schwerpunkt we often discuss, and that people say, oh, but not this thing that don't exist, whatever. It was a massive body doctrine that the more you study about, the more coherent it turns out to be. And in the Renaissance, we're absolutely aware of that. Right? You can easily see it from the names they use themselves or pseudonyms as scholars, what kind of ideal of man was also the scholar, right? That would be crowned. Think about Petrarch, that are in the full wake of Roman classical tradition, etc. These are not random symbols. They're not random models. You cannot look at Botticelli and not understand that sort of the phenotype is connected with divine transfiguration. It's difficult. So, and we started a video about a series about alchemy that is definitely and hopefully being useful for understanding better this chapter. All right. Because it's basically the same older tradition refiltered in a moment in which most people had either forgotten it and or were using it without much of a theological check, in moments in which also these heresies were spreading, social unrest and so on, in a moment of greater political and historical fragmentation from any standpoint. So without this background, you can't really even explain things, again, like Protestantism, like the general closing attitude of the church, the sort of fracture that existed, that occurred across Europe, almost the paralysis or the lack of will, at least in countering the Ottoman invasion. And the picture is that this crisis, while material was accompanied mostly by a change in mindset, right? A big step down in terms of the ladder of gradual descendants from the Golden Age into the one of the Wolf, that in a sense characterizes what we call modernity and its broader way of thinking, and that people do not seem to be particularly concerned about, because today it's just basically tribalism that matters, in any other transcendental principle does not seem to properly connect with that. They think it does, but they don't understand it doesn't, because they don't know how to use that, and that's the main problem, right? But in a broader sense, again, being aware of the crisis, being aware of the broader implication from a spiritual standpoint that the plague brought about, and or that was maybe just the consequence of, I think, is an important historiographical theme that will have to be reapproached. Here I see that this is only the 23rd video about the crisis of the late Middle Ages. But again, I advise you also, because in the last year we made lots of videos about that, to check out the series about the various centuries. Like to look at the 14th century, for example, as a whole, right? And the 15th century, and appreciating maybe if you come from, I don't know, a preferential 12th or 13th, the deep change in mentality, in cadres of power, and general approach to the world. This also ties well together with our early modern Renaissance period content, except, as we were saying before, we mostly talk about warfare for that. For the Middle Ages, we explored a bit more, but it's about time we change this and that we start reasoning, in fact, in even broader and deeper terms, which is what we do on Schwerpunkt for a living, so to say. So very conceptual videos is somehow normal whenever I introduce certain medieval, certain broader socioeconomic, because this is meant to be somehow socioeconomical topics. And yeah, we made really many videos about medieval society, and there you will find, if you're specifically interested in this kind of stuff, lots of different content exactly about this, right? And these are some of the videos that I here, many of them I didn't even re-upload, unfortunately. They were good videos, as a matter of fact. So it's we'll have at a point also to, I don't know whether to repressinate the ones that didn't have like the created the well, because I probably at this point never re-upload also the older videos, because I could do that in 2021 because of that issue that you know, but I stopped doing so. So those are good videos, but also some of the least watched already at the time because society is not so pulling. But if these videos can introduce better also the broader period and can sort of satisfy any particular curiosity, or sort of can offer some general perspective on the issue, I think it can really, that our mission accomplished, and we'll stick to it. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.